Welcome back to the audio bookshelf. We hope you enjoy the book, and please don't forget to hit the like and subscribe buttons to get our latest content. Please enjoy. Pride is the Enemy. Presented by Theo E. David from the audio bookshelf. Chapter 1: The Rise and Fall of a King. In the beginning, there was a young man, eager to prove his worth to the world. He had ambition, passion, and the will to succeed. But as time passed, something began to change within him. What once was a humble desire to improve became a relentless hunger for power, a pride that clouded his judgment and twisted his vision. This young man was not born into greatness, nor was he heir to any throne. He had no royal blood, no lineage of kings or queens to claim. Instead, he built his life from the ground up, one brick at a time, each stone representing a hard-earned success. The people around him saw his struggle and admired him for it. They respected him, and in return, he granted them his trust. But with every victory came a new challenge, and with every challenge, the young man grew more confident in his own abilities. As his wealth and influence grew, so did his ego. He no longer viewed the world as a place of opportunity, but as a stage upon which he was destined to shine above all others. He began to distance himself from those who had once been his allies, believing they were beneath him. The advice of his mentors fell on deaf ears, their warnings lost to the winds of his ambition. It was as if the more he achieved, the less he understood the value of humility. The world had become a mirror, reflecting only his own greatness. The young man's pride became his greatest strength and his most dangerous weakness. He surrounded himself with people who praised him, who fed into his growing arrogance. His decisions, once guided by careful thought and consideration, now became impulsive and driven by an insatiable thirst for recognition. At first, the changes were subtle. A small decision here, a slight shift in his tone there. But soon, the cracks in his character became impossible to ignore. He was no longer the humble man who had once earned his place through hard work and perseverance. He had transformed into something else entirely, a person whose pride ruled every aspect of his life. And yet, it was not just the people around him who began to notice. His success, though impressive, began to falter. Opportunities once within reach slipped away, and challenges that he would have easily conquered in the past now seemed insurmountable. The world that had once bowed before him now stood in defiance. It was in these moments of struggle that the young man began to realize the truth he had been blind to for so long. His pride had not made him strong, but had instead led him down a path of isolation and self-destruction. What he had once believed to be the source of his power was, in fact, his greatest enemy. In the end, the young man would learn the harshest of lessons: pride, when unchecked, is not a friend, but a foe. It is a force that, once allowed to grow unchecked, can bring even the mightiest of kings to their knees. Chapter 2: The Fall Begins. As the young man's empire began to crack, he refused to see the truth that everyone else had already recognized. His pride kept him blind to the warning signs, the whispers of those around him who had once served him loyally. They spoke of his arrogance, of his disregard for the advice of his closest advisors. But the young man, now a figure of power, saw himself as untouchable, above the fray. He believed that nothing could shake his dominance, for he had already proven himself to the world. But with every failed attempt, every opportunity lost, the cracks grew wider. His enemies, once hidden in the shadows, began to take notice. They could see the man's vulnerability, his weaknesses, and they started to strike. They were not driven by the same pride he had once held so dear, but by something far more dangerous: patience. They knew that a man consumed by his own pride would ultimately fall, and so they waited for the right moment to strike. It wasn't long before the young man found himself fighting battles on multiple fronts. His business ventures failed, his political alliances crumbled, and even his most trusted friends began to turn their backs on him. Those who once revered him as a genius began to see him as a fool, a man too blinded by his own greatness to see the consequences of his actions. Despite all of this, the young man refused to admit defeat. He clung to his pride, believing that it would somehow save him from the chaos he had created. He continued to make decisions that, in hindsight, were clearly flawed. But his pride would not allow him to back down or seek help. To do so would be to admit that he was wrong, something his inflated ego could never allow. As time went on, the young man's world grew smaller. His once vast network of supporters and allies dwindled, replaced by rivals and enemies. His reputation, once a symbol of strength, now became a symbol of arrogance. People no longer looked at him with respect, they saw him as a cautionary tale. The man who had risen so high, only to fall so far. And yet, even as his empire crumbled, the young man's pride held firm. He refused to acknowledge that the very thing that had brought him to the top was the same thing that had dragged him down. It was a bitter irony that he could not see. His downfall, which could have been avoided with humility and self-awareness, was now inevitable. As the walls of his world closed in around him, the young man found himself alone. The lavish parties, the grand celebrations, the endless stream of admirers, all of it had vanished. He was left in a silence that echoed the emptiness of his soul. The man who had once commanded the world now had nothing but the remnants of his pride, and even that was beginning to fade. In this desolate place, the young man began to ask himself questions he had never considered before. What had he truly gained in his pursuit of power and glory? What had all of his successes meant if they were built on the fragile foundation of his own ego? And, most importantly, was it too late for him to change? Chapter 3: The Awakening. In the solitude of his downfall, the young man was forced to confront the truth that had eluded him for so long. For the first time in years, he was no longer surrounded by the voices of those who had once praised him. There were no sycophants, no advisors eager to inflate his ego. There was only silence. And in that silence, a thought began to form: had it all been worth it? The man who had once prided himself on his invincibility now found himself questioning the very foundation of his existence. His wealth, his status, his accomplishments, they all seemed meaningless in the face of the collapse that surrounded him. It was as if the world had turned on him in an instant, and now there was no escape from the consequences of his arrogance. He wandered through the ruins of his empire, the echoes of his past success haunting every corner. The once grand halls that had hosted celebrations now stood empty and cold. The gleaming buildings that symbolized his power now looked tired and forgotten. The young man could feel the weight of his own pride pressing down on him like a burden he could no longer carry. In the quiet moments, when the noise of the world seemed distant, he would replay his decisions in his mind. The choices that had led him to this point seemed so clear now, so obvious. Each misstep, each moment of hubris, was painfully visible. But at the time, he had been blind to them. His pride had drowned out all other voices, and in doing so, it had blinded him to the truth. He thought back to the people he had once trusted, the friends, the mentors, the advisors who had warned him, who had tried to steer him away from the path he was on. How many had he pushed aside? How many had he dismissed, believing they were not worthy of his attention? How many had left because they could no longer stand to watch him destroy himself? The young man now understood the true cost of his pride. It wasn't just the loss of his empire, it was the loss of the relationships, the bonds that had once given his life meaning. But even in his despair, a flicker of something else began to stir within him. It was small at first, barely noticeable, a spark of humility, a recognition that he had been wrong. For the first time, he was willing to accept that his pride had led him astray. That realization, though painful, was the first step toward something else, something he had not allowed himself to consider before: change. The young man knew that the journey ahead would not be easy. He had alienated too many people, damaged too much to expect things to return to what they once were. But perhaps, just perhaps, there was a way to rebuild. Not the empire he had once ruled, but something deeper, something more meaningful. He had lost the world, but in losing it, he had gained something else, the understanding that power, when wielded without humility, was nothing more than an illusion. For the first time in years, the young man allowed himself to feel vulnerable. And in that vulnerability, he found the seed of a new beginning. A beginning that would require him to face his pride, to confront it head-on and accept its place in his past. As the days passed, he took small steps. He reached out to those he had once cast aside, offering apologies, seeking forgiveness. He didn't expect all of them to accept, nor did he believe that everything could be fixed. But he was ready to try, ready to embrace the difficult road ahead, no matter how long or painful it might be. It was in these quiet moments of introspection that the young man learned a powerful lesson. It wasn't too late to change, to seek redemption. He had lost much, but he still had time, and that time was his to shape. The world had not completely turned its back on him, and neither had he completely turned away from the possibility of rebuilding. For the first time in a long while, the young man believed that pride could be overcome. But he also knew that it would take more than just the desire to change. It would require action, humility, and above all, patience. The road to redemption was long, but it was one that he was now ready to walk. Chapter 4: The Path of Humility. With each passing day, the young man's understanding of his own limitations deepened. The recognition of his pride was not a simple thing. It wasn't just about acknowledging that he had been arrogant or that he had hurt others. It was about truly grasping the depth of how his pride had shaped every facet of his life. He had viewed his ambition as something noble, his desire for greatness as an undeniable force. But now, he could see how his ambition had twisted his perception of the world, how his thirst for recognition had led him to trample over those who had once stood by his side. The first step in his journey of redemption was perhaps the hardest, admitting that he had been wrong. Not just to others, but to himself. For years, he had convinced himself that he was on the right path, that everything he did was justified by his vision of success. But now, in the stillness of his fall, he could no longer deny the truth. His pride had blinded him to the needs of those around him, and in doing so, it had destroyed everything he had worked so hard to build. He began to reach out, slowly at first, to the people he had wronged. It was difficult, humiliating even, but necessary. He wrote letters, made phone calls, and, in some cases, traveled long distances to find those he had once trusted. Some of them, understandably, were unwilling to listen. They had their own wounds to heal, their own scars left by his actions. But some did listen. Some accepted his apology. And even if they didn't immediately forgive him, they at least heard him out, allowing him the chance to begin rebuilding the bridges he had burned. The young man learned, too, that redemption wasn't a simple or quick process. It wasn't something that could be achieved by a few well-placed words or a handful of sincere apologies. It was a commitment, a long and winding road that would take years, not months. But with each small step, he began to feel a shift in himself. The weight of his pride, which had once held him in its grip, started to lift. It was replaced by something more powerful, something he had never truly experienced before: empathy. For the first time, the young man was able to see the world through the eyes of others. He understood, in a way he never had, the struggles of those he had once seen as beneath him. He saw their hardships, their triumphs, and their own journeys of growth. And in this newfound understanding, he began to realize that he was not above them, not in any way. The world did not revolve around him. He was just one small part of a much larger, interconnected whole. This shift in perspective changed him in ways he hadn't anticipated. He started listening more, speaking less. He sought the counsel of those he had once dismissed, recognizing that their wisdom had value, even if he hadn't seen it before. He began to surround himself with people who challenged him, people who were not afraid to point out his flaws, who did not hesitate to call him out when he strayed from the path of humility. It was uncomfortable, but it was necessary. He needed to hear the truth, even when it was painful. But humility wasn't just about listening to others. It was about confronting his own fears, his own insecurities. For so long, he had hidden behind the mask of pride, afraid to show vulnerability. He had believed that to be strong meant to never show weakness. But now, he was learning that true strength came from accepting his imperfections, from being honest about his shortcomings, and from having the courage to ask for help when he needed it. In his moments of reflection, he often thought about the empire he had lost, the businesses, the wealth, the influence. At times, he mourned the life he had once known, the power he had enjoyed. But he also understood that those things were fleeting, fragile. They could be taken away in an instant, as they had been. The lessons he was learning now, however, were different. They were deeper, more lasting. They were not dependent on external success or recognition. They were rooted in something far more enduring, the ability to connect with others, to be vulnerable, to live with integrity. The young man also found himself grappling with the notion of forgiveness, both asking for it and granting it. He had hurt many people, and some of them had forgiven him, but others had not. Some may never forgive him, and he knew that was something he would have to live with. He could not control how others responded to him, but he could control his own actions. He could continue to work toward being a better person, someone worthy of forgiveness, even if it took time for others to come to that place. Over time, the young man's world began to shift again, but in ways he hadn't expected. He was no longer driven solely by the pursuit of success, but by the desire to help others. He began to mentor those who were starting their own journeys, offering the lessons he had learned from his fall. He worked with communities, volunteered his time, and started using his resources to support causes that mattered to him. It wasn't about building another empire, it was about making a difference in the lives of others. As he continued on his path of redemption, the young man realized that he had finally found what he had been searching for all along. It wasn't power. It wasn't recognition. It was peace. Peace that came from knowing he had learned from his mistakes, peace that came from living with humility and gratitude, peace that came from knowing he was no longer the man he had once been. The road ahead was still uncertain. He knew that there would be moments when his pride would resurface, moments when the temptation to return to his old ways would be strong. But he also knew that he was stronger now, that he had the tools to resist. And, more importantly, he had learned the true meaning of pride, that it was not something to be conquered, but something to be kept in balance, something to be respected. In the end, the young man's journey was not one of achieving greatness, but of finding humility. It was a lesson that could never be learned from books or speeches. It was a lesson only gained through experience, through the hard and painful process of falling and rising again. And though he had lost much, he knew now that what he had gained was far more valuable than anything he had once chased. Chapter 5: Rebuilding from the Ashes. Months passed, and the young man's life slowly began to take on a new form. The journey toward redemption was far from easy, and the scars of his past were still very much present. But something inside him had shifted, and that shift was beginning to take root in his actions. Where there had once been a relentless drive for power, there was now a quiet determination to live with integrity. Where pride had once been his guide, humility now led the way. He focused less on what he had lost and more on what he could still contribute. He poured his energy into small acts of kindness, the kind of gestures he had once overlooked in his pursuit of grand achievements. Helping someone move, offering a listening ear, supporting a friend through their own struggles, these were the things that started to fill the void that once was occupied by his endless ambitions. In these quiet moments, he realized that the true measure of a man wasn't in the wealth he accumulated or the power he wielded, but in how he treated others, and how he used his resources to make a difference in the world around him. But even as the young man began to rebuild his life, he could not escape the shadow of his former self. He was constantly reminded of the mistakes he had made, of the relationships he had broken. And though he had apologized, though he had sought to make amends, the past had a way of lingering in the present. Some people still regarded him with suspicion. Others had moved on entirely, unwilling to look back or invest their time in someone they saw as having failed them. There were days when the weight of this rejection felt unbearable. He longed for the days when he had been admired, when people had looked to him for guidance and inspiration. The young man had once lived for the validation of others, and now, without it, he often felt as if he was drifting, unsure of his place in the world. But as the months went on, he began to see something important. He no longer needed the validation of others to feel whole. His worth was no longer defined by how the world saw him, but by how he saw himself. And in the quiet moments of reflection, he began to recognize that he was worthy, not because of his past successes, but because of his ability to learn, to grow, and to change. This was the new foundation upon which he began to rebuild. It was not one of grandeur, not one of empire building, but one of steady progress. He didn't seek fame or fortune. Instead, he focused on making an impact, however small, in the lives of those around him. It was a slow process, a quiet kind of work, but it was work that mattered. The young man also began to make amends in ways that were more profound than just words. He reconnected with old friends, not by asking for their forgiveness, but by showing them through his actions that he had changed. He took responsibility for the damage he had caused, but he didn't expect anyone to simply forget the past. Instead, he allowed the work of redemption to speak for itself. He knew that rebuilding trust was not something that could be rushed, but something that took time and effort. There were moments of doubt, moments when he wondered if he was fooling himself, if the changes he had made were enough to heal the wounds he had caused. But each time that doubt crept in, he reminded himself that change was not linear. It wasn't something that could be measured in a single moment, but in the accumulation of actions, of small, consistent efforts to live with honesty and humility. And though he still struggled with moments of pride, he now understood that those moments were not the end of the road, but simply reminders of the path he had chosen, a path that required constant self-awareness and growth. As time passed, the young man found solace in helping others who were struggling with the same issues he had once faced. He sought out those who were caught in the grip of their own pride, their own ambition, and tried to offer them the wisdom he had gained through his own fall. He didn't claim to have all the answers, but he shared what he had learned about the importance of humility, about the dangers of unchecked ambition, and about the power of forgiveness, both given and received. In these efforts, he discovered something he had never known before, a deep sense of fulfillment that came from giving, from helping others rise above their own struggles. It was a fulfillment that had nothing to do with personal achievement or recognition. It was a fulfillment born from knowing that he had made a positive difference in someone else's life. Still, there were times when he wondered what his life would have looked like if he had never been consumed by his pride. What if he had been more humble from the start? What if he had avoided the mistakes he had made, the pain he had caused? But as he reflected on these questions, he realized that the person he had become, the man who had learned to listen, to empathize, to grow, was the product of everything he had gone through, both the good and the bad. The pain of his fall, the lessons he had learned, had shaped him into someone better, someone who could now see the world with clearer eyes. And though he couldn't change the past, he could change how he moved forward. The young man continued to live a life of service, of quiet impact. He no longer sought to conquer the world, but to improve it, one small act at a time. His past would always be a part of him, but it no longer defined him. What defined him now was his commitment to live with humility, to make amends where possible, and to always strive to be a better person than he had been the day before. And in the end, the young man realized that he had found something far more meaningful than the empire he had once built. He had found peace within himself, and a deep, abiding sense of purpose that came from living with humility, from helping others, and from facing the consequences of his actions with grace and dignity. It was a peace that could not be taken away, no matter the circumstances, no matter the challenges that still lay ahead. And in that peace, he finally understood what true greatness was. Chapter 6: The Legacy of Humility. Years had passed since the young man's fall from grace, and though much had changed, some things remained constant. The world around him had continued to evolve, and so had he. The lessons of his past were now woven into the fabric of his daily life, guiding every decision he made, every relationship he nurtured. He was no longer the ambitious, prideful figure who once sought greatness at any cost. He was a man who had learned to measure success not by what he could accumulate or control, but by how he could help others, by how he could contribute to the greater good. It wasn't always easy. The temptation to revert to his old ways still lingered, especially in moments of stress or uncertainty. But now, he knew how to recognize those moments for what they were, opportunities to grow, to choose humility over pride. He had learned to forgive himself for his past mistakes, understanding that redemption was not a destination but an ongoing journey. It was a path of continual self-improvement, a path he was committed to walking for the rest of his life. One of the most profound changes came in his relationship with the people around him. Where he once viewed others as stepping stones on his path to success, he now saw them as partners in the shared journey of life. He listened more intently, spoke with more care, and treated everyone with the respect they deserved, regardless of their status or position. He had learned that true leadership was not about commanding from above, but about serving from within. And in serving others, he found a sense of fulfillment that he had never known in his pursuit of power. As the years continued to pass, the young man found himself reflecting more and more on the legacy he wanted to leave behind. He had come to understand that a legacy was not built on monuments or wealth, but on the impact one had on the lives of others. He knew that he would not be remembered as a king or a ruler, nor would his name be etched into history for great conquests or accomplishments. But he also knew that this was not the legacy he had sought. The legacy he wanted to leave was one of kindness, humility, and the belief that anyone, no matter their past, could change for the better. He began to take on new challenges, not because he sought recognition, but because he genuinely wanted to make a difference. He worked with organizations that focused on social change, spent time mentoring young people who were at risk of making the same mistakes he once had, and even began to write, sharing his story in the hopes that others could learn from his experiences. He understood now that his failures did not define him, but his willingness to change and grow was what truly mattered. One day, after many years of quiet work, the young man sat with an old friend, a person he had once alienated but who had later accepted his apology and stayed by his side. They reminisced about their shared history, about the times when they had worked together before the young man's fall. The friend, now older, looked at him with a knowing smile. "You know," his friend said, "I always thought you had it in you. I think a lot of us did. But what you've done, what you've become, it's far more than any of us could have imagined. You've built something that lasts." The young man smiled, but there was no pride in it. Only gratitude. "I didn't build it," he said quietly. "I learned it. It took losing everything to understand what really mattered." The conversation was a moment of peace for the young man, a recognition that while his journey had been long and painful, it had led him to a place of true fulfillment. He had learned that greatness was not measured by the heights one could climb, but by the humility with which one could serve, by the wisdom gained through hardship, and by the willingness to grow despite one's past. And so, as he continued his life, the young man no longer sought to conquer the world. Instead, he sought to live a life of integrity, of service, and of kindness. His legacy would not be written in the pages of history books, nor would it be found in the headlines of the future. It would be found in the lives he touched, in the hearts he healed, and in the quiet, steadfast work he did every day to make the world a better place. In the end, the young man realized that the true enemy had never been his circumstances, nor the challenges he faced. It had been his own pride, which had nearly destroyed everything he held dear. And in conquering that pride, he had found the truest form of greatness, a life of humility, a life of service, a life that was not defined by what he had achieved, but by the person he had become. His story, though one of struggle and loss, was ultimately a story of redemption. And it was a story he would continue to live, one day at a time, until the very end. The end. Thanks for listening, and please don't forget to hit the like and subscribe buttons and also click the small bell icon to receive a notification every time a new free audiobook has arrived. Thanks again.